Misha here, and this is unplanned, but hopefully still appreciated and enjoyed. Third part is I look at 5.45 by 39 here at the end of 2025. Part 1, we looked at the original AK74 represented by my SLR 105 and the AKS74 represented by the SLR 104FR. And then in part 2, we looked at the modernized AK74M, represented by the SGL31, and the RPK74M, and RPK for that 74 for that matter, represented by the Vepr. Part 3, the unplanned one, because I just ended up having more content than is really warranted for a single video. Yeah, even I have my limits as far as length. Is going to talk about ownership in America. We're going to talk about the 5.45 cartridge, its past, present, and if I think there's any future. And we're going to talk about semi-automatics specifically. Mainly imports, but a little bit of other stuff. That's why we started off kind of with this one, because it's your bog standard gun. It'll pop in and out throughout the video. And footage from here and from the cabin will pop in as well. So with that, unfortunately, my RPK Molot sanction video was removed by YouTube. Just it'd been up since 2018 and it was taken down. So, what do you do? Such is life. But I appreciate you tuning in, supporting the channel. If you'd like to help support more, you can do a super thanks or go over to Patreon. But liking, sharing, subscribing, commenting with your own guns, those are all great too. Again, I wish there was some new exciting AK content I had for you, but we're going over the history, and we can still double back around. There's definitely more AKM talk we can do and whatnot, but that's kind of the broad strokes. Started off early in the year with the AK and RPK and worked our way through the AK74 and RPK74, which are still valid today. And reliable, I will say. The 5.45 guns almost always are. It feeds very well. Very gentle recoil. It does heat up, though. And the magazines are cool. The cartridge in America began, at least official imports, outside of just, randoms here and there that came in. Heck, in the 80s, even things like the CIA had some tough time getting 5.45 by 39, 53 grain stuff. First official imports were around 1995 with Century Arms. And then Intrac would join in about a year later. And a lot of this early on was the Ulyanovsk stuff. Wolf would join, and as well as the Bear ammos, Brown Bear, Silver Bear. You get Golden Tiger in 5.45 eventually. And yes, Red Army Standard out of Romania, which is actually quite good because of Romania's placement and use of the 5.45 cartridge. And it would take time. It was a very slow process because there really weren't any guns in America firing the 5.45 round. Not in the 90s. It's a bit of a miracle it came over anyway, but keep in mind this is fall of not just the USSR, but the entire comm block structure. And most of your nations are switching from 5.45 either back to 7.62 by 39 or 5.56 NATO. The good news is for us, there's lots of parts, mags, and surplus ammo that they don't want to pay to store. U.S. importers want to bring over, civilians want to buy. It's all a great deal for everyone because they're able to sell the stuff pretty much cheap because they have no money in it, essentially. This is why a lot of the early ammo for the first decade and a half is pretty affordable, and the guns themselves. And we'll pick back up with Bulgarian stuff, including the SLR series in a minute. But I want to share with you my first 5.45, which I'm sure you know, but we're doing a retrospective. If you maybe just keep one 5.45 gun, I don't know if I could, because even though I don't own that many, I kind of love them all for different reasons. So we'll talk about that too. He didn't get to come out to the cabin with me this time, as I said. Yeah, Jero's rig was already packed up, but my good old Romanian SAR-2. Although, of course, when I purchased it over 20 years ago, coming up on 25 now, it didn't look like this. To be fair, it couldn't back then. I love this gun. Part of it is just straight up reliable. And it was my first, and you never forget your first. And they're a legitimate user. You know, not that many nations adopted 5.45, not compared to 7.62x39. Countless nations have used 7.62x39, and for that matter, 5.56 NATO. You could almost count the number of nations that officially adopted and issued in large quantity rifles, carbines, and 5.45 on two hands. Especially if you just kind of lump in all the former Soviet republics as, you know, just inheriting from the USSR. Outside of the USSR, you really only had East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania in Europe. That's really it, outside of just, again, tiny little things here and there. And that's why this being Romanian is pretty cool. And was really the first mass available 5.45 gun in America. Technically, it was the third gun. But the first two, well, one was tiny numbers. Under 100 Chinese 88S semi-autos came in at the tail end of the 80s. What's funny about that, even though China made that 5.45 gun, they never adopted it, not even close. Ironically, North Korea did adopt what was known as the Type 88. I have unfounded suspicions that a lot of that North Korean stuff was set up by China, and maybe the reason we got semi-automatic 88Ss was because of that partnership going on at the time. Again, unfounded, but they're close allies and same type. And why else would China have done that cartridge? They did reverse engineer it. They didn't get it from Russia. Very few of those came in. Big money. So technically that was the first. But then we also got the SSG-82. Now that's not an AK. It was an East German, a DDR bolt action used along the Berlin Wall. More of those came in along with a small supply of ammo. I remember guys talking when you bought the SSG-82, it came with a couple of hundred rounds of 5.45 ammo out of East Germany, or formerly East Germany. Guys would buy the guns and think, okay, after I shoot this ammo, what am I going to do? Where am I going to get more ammo? Valid concern until mass importation of the ammo began in the mid and late 90s. So those two technically came in before. I don't know how many of the 82s came in, but it was not a huge number. But it was also just a bolt action. This was really the first. Well, this is the SAR-2, which was the first mass import, and the one that most of us, myself included, first saw. But it wasn't the very first one out of Romania. No, that would be mid-1997 when Intrac would import the CUR-2 and the MK2. Those are the first 5.45 guns. Soon, Dominion Investment Group, DIG, would also get in the game. So, 97 to 99, we would also see the WUM-2, which was interesting, and the Romac 992, which was a single stacker, and the Romac 2, which was a double stacker. Generally speaking, these are kind of all over the place. Small numbers. Some had square back receivers. Some had kind of a half moon cut. Some did have the upswept charging handle, but also they weren't built with all matching parts. Some had a limiter for the selector. Some had a block in the back so a full auto carrier couldn't go in. Some did have threaded muzzles, but the threads were covered up by a nut. A lot of them had nothing under the nut. All had to comply with the 89 ban, which did not allow threaded muzzles, bayonet lugs, effectively foregrips, folding stocks. And then, of course, in 94, there was the federal assault weapons ban, which made things domestically that way. And then in April of 98, the Clinton administration added on to the Bush administration, which itself added on to the Gun Control Act of 1968, meaning that double-stack mags weren't allowed in, which is a little funny because the SAR series did not start coming in via Century Arms until 1999. SAR-1 and 7.62, and of course SAR-2 and 5.45, SAR-3 and 5.56. This would be the first kind of mass importation. Just, the first ones that you could commonly see. And N-Track and Dominion would go their own ways, and Century would begin their long-standing partnership with the Kuger, however you say it, it's fine, in Romania, who had built these. Now, as I said, Romania was an official user of the cartridge, and they made their own rifle. What's unique here, though, unlike Bulgaria and East Germany, that basically we'll call the TDP, that's not what it was called, but you get the idea. Romania, along with Poland, both didn't want to pay the Soviet Union for the cartridge or the rifle, so they used their AKM as a basis and reverse engineered it. And this would lead to some interesting oddities. And that's how they developed and introduced the PA-86 into production, although the first few years seem a little bit limited. There's still a lot of 7.62 39 guns in use by 89 when we see the revolution taking place. But in the 90s, this became a very common thing. Now, they did use a 53 grain projectile. It basically had a 1 in 8 twist. Okay, I know it's a 1 in 200, give or take, but we'll call it 1 in 8 for simplicity's sake. And they used cold hammer forged chrome lined barrels. And that's why getting an import from there is great. You get the same barrel, you get the same 1mm receiver with dimples. Even has the XY stamps on the side. Pretty cool phosphate finish. But that's where the similarities end. You could say, well, buy one of these, it's an AK74. And I thought so too when I first got it. When I first got this gun, it came with wood. And I put Bulgarian black polymer furniture fixed stock on it and tried to be happy with it. Because it was the assault weapons ban, we couldn't have a folding stock. Couldn't have bayonet lug. And what I did originally for the muzzle device is I took one meant for 14 mil threads and machined it out a bit and pressed it on and affixed it to the barrel, and it actually stayed on pretty well and did help with recoil. And this was a project of mine I've discussed many a times as I slowly put it to the way I wanted it to make it a pretty good PA-86 replica. By the way, after this was introduced as the standard rifle with the 16-inch barrel, they would introduce the PM93 as a light machine gun version, essentially their RPK, and they would have a shotgun. I've sometimes seen it mentioned as a PA-80 or PA-90, other things, because they're a little more inconsistent. They are out there, though, and I would love it if we could get those. Either the RPK or basically an AES-10, but in 5.45, call it an AES-2, or a Draco in 5.45. We once did get a Draco called the Champion 2007 in 5.56, and I did own one, but it wasn't the most reliable. My luck with Romanian 5.56 exports hasn't been great, but my 5.45 here, it's been a banger since day one. That's why I like it. It really is just, they took their military gun, they went through all the trials and testing, no longer has the third pin or a select fire trigger. By the way, the military guns actually had a 4-position selector with burst as an option. This is, of course, just safe and semi. And so you benefit from all that testing, trials, and that's why I think these guns have held up really well. Those receivers are properly heat treated, you get properly forged front trunnions. The rear trunnions are actually investment cast, and a proper barrel, which has kind of proven to be the big deal here. We'll get there in a minute. But yeah, after the assault weapons ban came off, I was able to make this gun look the way I wanted. Folding stock. This is kind of a copy of the East German style, but they gave it a push button and simplified it a bit. It also is canted out to the side a little bit. They never really offered a folder in military service, although for export, the military version is known as the AIMS 74 with the folder, or an AIM 74 as a fixed stock. So for export customers, they did offer. But the nice thing about the East German system, same rear trunnion, easy to swap back and forth. Now to go with that, we needed an upswept charging handle, just to clear it good. And these are extended out, they're a little skinnier. Some of the early imports, like the Kerr 2 and the Mark II, came with an upswept handle, but most of them, including the SAR2, did not. Luckily, I was able to find an unserial marked, unissued carrier at K-Bar years ago. Yeah, they once had a lot of Romanian parts. So I put it with that, but the bolt's the same. I didn't have to change the bolt out, thankfully. But that was the deal. For years, if you wanted to make one of these into a PA86 clone, the parts were pretty hard to come by. But that was also the fun. Now you notice I've put in a Bakelite mag here. That's because the guns, when you bought the SAR2, came with Bakelites, but they were East German. A couple of reasons for this. One, we're in the assault weapons ban, so guns had to be made, or excuse me, magazines had to be made before September of 1994. Since Romania was still producing their guns, it would be hard to certify that. Probably more importantly for Century, though, they had a bunch of leftover East German mags, and since East Germany quit making the 5.45 guns by like 1990, yeah, you definitely knew an East German Bakelite mag was pre-banned, so less argument, cheaper form, and they worked fine. Although, the magazine that this was meant for was a little different, harkening back to that based on the AKM. Here's a mag pouch for the PA86. And these mags were actually once pretty hard to find in America, if you wanted the Romanian version specifically, because they're metal. And they really are just a scaled down AKM mag. And this is what was and has always been used in the AIMS 74 export, or PA86, and would have come with the SAR2 probably if it had not been for the assault weapons ban, which thankfully did expire September in 2004, meaning magazines like this could come over even if they were made before 94. How do you prove it? They're not dated, so being currently in production kind of stymied them. So having the right mag surely helps. And this is one area when you slightly see it being based on the AKM, because the front trunnion and the magwell are just ever so slightly different. So sometimes I've noticed that these Romanian mags don't always seat just perfectly, comfortably, smoothly in other guns. You know, with your 7.62-39 guns, there was a standard for a magwell and a trunnion and a lockup. You know, you could pretty much swap them all across countries. With the 5.45 guns, you almost get that. Almost. But there's just a little bit of variance because of the different ways of getting there. Now, of course, when you get to the 5.56, oh boy, yeah, there's a lot of variation there. Anyway, right mag. And then I put the right concave pistol grip on. Bakelite upper handguard, because that's what they did. Originally, there was a Bakelite lower dong, but very quickly they got rid of that. I've actually never owned one. They're pretty uncommon. Now, even though you can use a dong from any of them, technically the PA86 dongs are just a little bit thinner, a little bit different shape. Probably just because of the weight of the gun. I never did mess with changing the gas block. Why fix it if it ain't broken? I didn't need a lug here. One thing you'll note about the Romanian production is they still have a 45-degree externally block, but internally they actually have kind of a double bend port to prevent bullet shearing, kind of like we talked about with the original AK74. Why they went to the 90-degree was to help with that for stability. And then out here was one piece that really did help putting it on the gun. I should also mention that in 2003, the Wasser series replaced the SAR series, so SAR1 became Wasser 10, SAR2 became Wasser 2. I think you get it. The main difference was a non-dimpled mag well with the cutout mag well. Otherwise the same. And so the SAR-2 would turn into the Wasser-2. And even though those were mostly imported post assault weapons ban, because they were so small numbers, they never did convert them. Some of them might have weird threads under a nut, some didn't. But I never really saw any Wasser 2s that came in with the proper front sight base. And again, early on, for years, it was hard to find. So putting it on, get you a bayonet lug. And I just so happen to have my Romy bayonet here. It's a derivative of the 6H4 with a unique hanger. And it just goes on. What's kind of fun about the way they did this is, even though they're interchangeable, the muzzle brake, and it is just a brake, is actually skinnier and longer than standard, and so the lug is in a different location. Speaking of the brake, even though it might look like a standard 74, it isn't. It's on 22mm threads, not 24. They did their own thing here too, and their own bayonet. So put this guy to rights as best I could, close enough for me anyway, and have enjoyed it ever since. Now, luckily, a few years back, some surplus AIM 74 PA 86 kits finally started coming in. Arms of America has had some, Atlantic, and that's allowed folks to do parts kits builds versus imports, because they officially discontinued the Wasser 2 in 2013, and then they kind of disappeared from the market over the next year. They never were a great seller. They never were. As much as you might think a factory 5.45 gun would be, they sold, but pretty small numbers. So it wasn't a big deal for them to discontinue it, and the Wasser 3 for that matter. But then the builds came in, more boutique things, and of course they would have a US, sorry, my button's being tight. Oh wow. You would have to have a US receiver, and you do need a specific 5.45 receiver and a US barrel, and you definitely would want something with basically a 1 in 8 twist. I know, again, the military is more like 1 in 7.9, but US barrels are 1 in 8, and that's fine. So if you see the AIM's builds, you're going to get all the remaining in parts and features, stock, dong, all that, but you will have a US receiver, a US barrel. There's nothing wrong with them. Of course, the parts will be used, so, you know, there's that, but you will get a new bore. If that's the only option we had, I would own one of those, because they're pretty cool and priced accordingly. But with SAR-2s and Wasser 2s imported and not in huge market demand, I'd still recommend looking for one. Now, in modern times, the prices have finally kind of shot up on these, but for a long, long time, you could pick up just as imported Wasser 2 or even SAR-2 for a pretty good song. So it was a clear choice. You even got a side rail. Nowadays, yeah, it might be a little harder to do, but even then, they're still out there. They're still one of the most common, if not probably the most common, imported 5.45 guns. And I like imports, but I'm not a complete snob against parts kits if that's your only option. And that moves us on to our next nation, Poland, and the famous, and thanks to centuries, sometimes infamous, WZ-88 Tantal. And this is a parts kits build, because we've never had a semi-automatic Tantal import. And you had a few different people building these, because the kits became very, very available around this time frame, 2004, 2005, 2006. I think they sent pretty much their entire stock over. Poland, like Romania, reverse engineered their AKM. And it really lasted throughout the entire 80s. It's a whole saga we're not going to go into with worker strikes and revisions. But They did their own thing. And finally, in 1988, it passed state testing, state trials. The project was known as Tantal, and it was adopted into military service as the WZ-88. Although production would still take another year or two, and by that time, the USSR is on the outs, kind of stumbling around like a drunken boxer, and the comm block's breaking apart 89 through 91. So they really don't even want it. But they do order it, at least initial batch of around 25,000. Originally they were going to buy 100,000 or more, and that was basically to keep the Radom factory going. They'd put a decade's worth of investment into this, and they did need a high velocity, small diameter bullet of some type, so they just bought 25,000. And based on the kits we got, most of them never even got issued out, or if so, very lightly. So by the time it actually went into military service, the WZ-88 was no longer needed. This is why it was replaced even under a decade later with the WZ-96 Beryl, which is still in service today, although it's being phased out for the Grot, which I really hope we get an import of those. So feature-wise, it actually uses a copy of the East German stock here. Mine's really stiff on this gun. Same benefits as we saw with Romania. Rib top cover. Very unique handguard system with kind of a QD handguard here, so they can attach the 1974 underbarrel grenade launcher in later versions too. Thin cleaning rod. Still has a 16 1/4 barrel, but it's a very different arrangement up here. And on this side it looks very normal, but on this side you'll see a selector. Now this is just a dummy on this gun. Some makers would actually turn this into a left side linked one, but there were issues with that. This one's just here for cosmetics. It does nothing. So that's how you could set your fire mode. And on this side, this was your safety itself. This is not really an AK-74, because aside from using the same projectile, they also used a 53 grain bullet. Yeah, they did their own thing. They even brought over their manual dust cover latch from their WZ-60 grenade launcher. Here's a Polish pouch. Yes, there is a specific pouch for a Tantal, but this was closer. And it has the second pattern of mag. Very, very, very much like the Russian and Bulgarian, just with a mold mark there, nothing here. Polymer with metal. These mags were pretty common in America for a good long while. But their first pattern was actually a steel mag, very much like the Romanian. In fact, it's hard to tell them apart, but there are minor differences. And frankly, because the Tantal was produced so briefly, just a couple of years, and so few were made, that's really the only major change. Early steel mag, later polymer. I have seen some black handguards on these, but it does take a unique upper. The lower is standard. This is Bakelite. This is kind of a polymer. It does use the same kind of slightly fat pistol grip like some of their AKMs. It's a really cool gun for what it is. And I mentioned out here, it's a little different. This was meant for grenade launching and to be a muzzle brake. And interestingly, it's on 14 mil threads. Although because the muzzle sticks through further, it's not really interchangeable. And it does have a standard lug. And it takes the same bayonet that Poland's been using for a long time. It's actually a transitional 6H3, H4, with one important difference. There are no saw teeth on it. That's just how Poland did. I guess they felt like the saw teeth weren't useful, maybe even a detriment, so they didn't do them for their AKMs or their Tantals, or later even the Beryls. And there's that. There's also this lug here for a kind of a A1, M16A1 style clip-on bipod. Cool gun, but we only ever got parts kits. And that gets us to a thing. I really do think they sent all their guns over here. Now, you had some good makers like Inner Arms. They made some good ones. My very first one was actually built at Military Gun Supply. I ordered it, I guess 2005. It was after the sunset because it had features. Because I was wanting something a little more like an AK74 compared with my SAR-2. I mean, keep in mind, guys, I was learning then too. I didn't realize that the Tantal, while cool, was no more an AK-74, at least Russian Bulgarian pattern, than my Romanian, really. But, you know, this was early days. We didn't know a lot about AKs, and I just saw it on their website, and these were cheap enough back then. You could just buy one. It wasn't like a major investment in capital like it is today. I've said many times in videos, if I had been getting into AKs today with their costs, even adjusting for inflation, I'm not going to say I wouldn't own AKs, but I would probably just own a couple. Back then, though, they were literally half the price of even just a like a Smith & Wesson AR. Not a bad one, but not a great one. They were probably a third the cost of a Colt. So you could just kind of buy one on a lark. Especially the Century Arms Tantal Sporters. Before we move on, I just have to talk about this a minute. Because most of your Tantals out there are the Centuries. And the problem is they use 3 different barrels, specifically bore twist rates that I'm aware of. A 1-in-7, a 1-in-8, and a 1-in-9. And that gets us to the keyholing thing. And it was exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the ammo in the country wasn't the 53 grain, although there was plenty of surplus 7 and 6 about this time coming in, but there was also a lot of the 60 grain stuff and some 50 grain. So on top of that, you're kind of messing with grain weights and doing all that, yada yada. And there was the keyholing thing. Here's the problem. There were a bunch of people saying, oh, if it's serial this, serial that, it's okay, it's not. That might have been an okay rule of thumb, but I talked with Century several times. I used to distribute for them quite a bit. They don't know. They bought these barrels. They threw them in big bins to use on the assembly line. They really don't know which guns got which barrels. Therefore, there was no safe way to know, hey, this is a good one, this is a not good one. If you knew it was a later production one, like if it came new from them, it was a better bet. But even then, there's always a chance that at the bottom of the bin, you might have got a barrel that had been hanging out there for a year. But I have to ask this. So fucking what? I fully admit I can't shoot for groups or for accuracy. But, come on. Did it really matter? Yes. Did it matter as much as people made it out to be? No. And there's several reasons why. One, the Century Tantal, having the U.S. barrel and U.S. receiver, it wasn't a collector's item in the first place. And it was cheap. Especially after the issue became known. And it still had a nice parts kit on it. 2, they were usually shooting surplus ammo. If nothing else, this is the time when 5.45 is 10 cents around. And it wasn't match grade ammo anyway. 3, so what if it keyholed? It's still grouped. And it, most importantly to me, wasn't unsafe. If it was blowing guns up or damaging bores or, hitting the ends of... It wasn't doing any of that. In fact, most people would have never known it was even keyholing except they were shooting paper. Here's the trick, though. The way 5.45 works, the whole tumbling thing's a bit of a myth, but it does have yaw. People tried shooting it at like 25 yards, and they would see what they thought was a keyhole. Then they would try it again at 50 and 100 yards, and guess what? They would get a perfectly circular hole. I think a lot of it, just like with canted sights, because canted sights are real on AKs, but when you're so paranoid about a problem, sometimes you get overly critical and see issues where none exist. And even if you're keyholes, these are plinking guns. The Tantal, the ammo, and they were perfectly good plinkers. So my kind of takeaway is there were a lot of good bargains for folks who didn't care, didn't mind. And I will say, too, I suggested to people, if you're having trouble with keyholing with, say, surplus 7 and 6, grab a box of Wolf. Or, bear ammo. Maybe changing up the ammo type would keep it from keyholing, or at least as bad. I'm just saying it wasn't the end-all. It wasn't the death nail it was made out to be. But, as I've said, the internet is going to internet. But there was never a way to get a Tantal semi-automatic import because these were already out of production by the time FB Radom guns came over. We got the Archer, which is actually, the bones of it are very close to this, just being in 5.56 and little modern features. You could take a Tantal parts kit and rebuild an Archer or a Beryl Sporter and make it look a lot like a Tantal, just not having the 5.45 caliber. I should also just briefly mention the Onyx, which was the little one, the WZ89. It never came over, although a pistol was approved for import. IO got approval and then never imported them, and that led to troubles. Look, if you know, you know. I'm not going into it now. But we did eventually get a Polish import 5.45, and you've recently seen it. The WBP Jack in 5.45. This gun annoys me because years ago when we were interviewing WBP and talking with them over the years, they said they would never do a 5.45 gun. But that was years back, and eventually they did it, and it kind of made me look like a jackass. But, it's one of those situations. I'm happy to be wrong when it works out well. And so we started getting these about a year ago. First we got parts kits in, and then we got the guns. And recently did a 1-year update on this. And I think to many folks' chagrin, it's still working well, and I'm having no troubles. And I'm going to be honest with you, most folks aren't either. The internet's going to internet. There are literally single-digit cases of issues, and that's just going to happen. I gotta ask, you gotta take any reports you read online with a healthy grain of salt, because you don't know the ammo, you don't know the situation, you don't know the people. And I wish this wasn't the case, but you don't know if folks are just lying. Because, I hate to tell you this, sometimes people just troll the internet, believe it or not. I know it's hard to think people would do that, but they do. I'm not saying everyone does. I'm just saying you have to just approach it with an open mind in both directions. Because if you talk to people that actually own a WBP, myself, who's I own one since 2018, several different ones. Most of my friends and families at least own one. None of us are having issues, and the vast majority of guys who actually do aren't either. I'm not saying there aren't going to be any, though, because, say it with me, everyone produces a lemon. Everyone. Well, except for maybe one gun. There is one AK that the internet never seems to have dogpiled on. We'll get to that later on in the video. But yeah, I haven't had issues with this, and most people haven't either. It's reliable. It's accurate. I know the 5.56 WBPs, especially early on, had accuracy things. They knew it too. The newer barrels are supposed to be better. Now, I did review a 5.56, one of theirs years ago, but it never super interested me. Just wasn't. If I want a 5.56 Polish gun, it's going to be a Beryl, and that's why I own a Beryl. This is more interesting just because there are only a handful of 5.45 imports, but this one does differ from the guns you've seen so far in Part 1, Part 2, and even the SAR-2. Those are all countries that use them for military and then kind of adapted their military gun for the civilian market here. That's not what happens with the WBP. When you're talking WBP 7.62-39 guns, they're very close to an AKM, because even though they're a private company, a commercial company, they would use FB Radom parts, including the cold hammer forged chrome line barrel, and their 1mm stamped receivers were actually made on the same old tooling that used to make the AKM, AKMS receivers for the Polish military. They've cycled around quite a bit. In other areas, they reproduce the laminate furniture, even though this is modern production furniture. It's great stuff. It really is. This is not a case of what you see with a lot of the Wassers. The 5.45 guns, though, they had the Tantal. They never had the TDP for the AK74 in Poland. So this is a reverse engineered jobber. Now, luckily, they have the 90-degree block and front sight base, 24mm threads. These are probably Bulgarian-made parts. I could be wrong. But the barrel While it is a 1 in 8 twist, while it is an imported barrel, it's a nitride barrel. It's not a chrome-lined cold hammer forged barrel. That doesn't mean it's dog crap. It just means you could argue that it's no better or worse than a U.S. barrel like we see in a lot of the Tantals, we see in the AIM 74 builds. One reason I tend to like imports is they have the military barrel. Well, this doesn't. But luckily, again, it's not having accuracy issues like the 5.56, at least not that I can tell. And again, internet's going to internet. I'll say this just for the record. The front trunnion is forged. The bolt is forged. Yes, the early parts kits were cast. Yes, in Europe, WBP, for military police customers, does offer cast guns. No, the ones imported by AOA, by WBP USA, do not. By the time the Jack, and before it the Fox came into the country, WBP read the room and realized Americans do not like cast trunnions. None of these have ever come in with a cast front trunnion, certainly not a cast bolt. If you have one, that is not a WBP part. That is from Pioneer or someone else, and that's where I'll end with this. People report issues with WBP, but when you really trace it down, it does not seem to be the imports like this. It seems to be kit builds or individual parts. I think there are two explanations for this. One, when you're buying just parts, they might have gone through some type of quality control, heat treat or all that at the factory. That's it. And then they're just a raw part. A rifle, though, it'll get assembled at the factory. If a part doesn't fit right, doesn't work right, doesn't look right, they throw it back in the bin or throw it in the smelter and grab another one. It costs them nothing. Also, rifles go through various levels of QC checking before they leave the door, and then usually the importer here does more QC checking. My point is, when you buy a complete imported gun, it goes through a lot more hands, a lot more eyes, gets a lot more scrutiny than just individual parts. I think that's why when we hear about issues, it comes from parts and kit builds, not really the import guns like this. Yeah, I know, you're about to type, well, what about this one? Again, say it with me. Everyone makes a lemon. There's always going to be one or two that slip through the cracks. It sucks, but we're all human, and we know that. Especially as WBP imports more and more to America. It's just going to happen. We see it with Romanian guns, Zastava guns. Yes, believe it or not, there were even some lemon Saigas. I know. Shocking, right? And I'll also say this. Make sure the part you're getting is WBP. Make sure the website knows what they have. And you might even say, well, this website, I trust them. But do they know? Some places just see Polish made and they assume. There are like 4 companies in Poland that are making AKM type parts. WBP is just one of them. So just because a certain website says it's WBP, you might just double check, because it's not like most of the small parts are marked. Some might have a mold mark. Larger ones might have Rago Poland on them, WBP, but a lot of times, guys, you're taking it on faith. So there's that. And there's also the builder factor. Keep in mind, it doesn't matter how good the parts are. It does matter about who built it and how they did. Now, AKs, they're not the hardest thing to build in the world, but they're not as easy as an AR, and I think some guys kind of assume they will be and get in a little over their head. Not as bad today as it used to be, but back in the early days of builds, screw builds, anyone remember those with me? Ugh. And guys who thought that was A-okay. That said, there are some things that bug me about this gun that I wish WBP would do differently, and we'll bounce back to those in a minute. Done a very deep dive into the SLR 105 before, so not going to cover that all. This was the first stamped Arsenal import to come in and be sold, and the first Arsenal 5.45 to actually go to market. They did actually experiment with a milled 5.45, the SLR 102, but it never made it past the prototype stage. Now, these appeared in 2004, 2005, and, they just had a few hundred, and that was it. They never brought more. They didn't do a folder. They were all fixed stock. We've already talked about the variants. Kind of makes me wonder if the reason they limited the numbers was that they were just using up the parts they had in Bulgaria, be they made from Arsenal or Tula. I don't know. It was an interesting run, but they were pretty expensive back then. And by that, I mean $500-600, which seemed like a lot when you could get a mill gun for $50-100 more. And of course, at that time, the popularity of 5.45 really hadn't hit its zenith in America yet. It was getting there, but it still had a little ways to go. Regardless, the SLR 105 was a highly praised gun, but what it led to was the SLR 107 series with the folder, the 7.62-39, and the SLR 106 series folders in 5.56. And they would do the full size, the FR, the intermediate, the CR, and even the Crink styles, the URs, the shorties. Those would appear 2006, 2007, and run for a few years, but this gun never did appear again, and a 5.45 offering never would appear, at least not until 2013. The first in the SLR 104 series would be the SLR 104 UR, the Crink, and it would come in as a carbine for reasons. The full-length 16-inch barrel version with the folder. They actually would not do a fixed stock version. So it's opposite of what we had before. Would not appear until very late 2013. These guns came in holiday season of that year, I remember quite clearly. And they would do them with different furniture, a solid body stock or a triangle. Keep in mind this is still the original 4.5mm pin. And you could get them with black furniture. A lot of people would put wood on them. And they definitely imported these in greater numbers than the 105. And for the time, the price was fine. I think they came in around $1,200 in the beginning, and then they lowered that. It's a different time. But even then, you gotta think about it. You could get a SAM 7 SF for still $100-200 more. And by this point, Arsenal had kind of missed the peak of 5.45. In fact, the timing here was pretty poor because that's right as the 7 and 6 ban was going into effect, cutting off cheap ammo, and the imports of commercial stuff, that was even getting a little... Unfortunately, this gun came too late. I wish it had come out 4 years, even 3 years earlier. 5 would be even better. If they had done the 104s at the same time as the 106s, 107s, I still don't think they would have sold that well. My evidence is Century imported the Wasser 10, the Wasser 2, 5.45, and the Wasser 3 and 5.56. In the Wasser 2s, like the SAR 2s before them, still never sold that well. But it was a niche item. Pretty cool. This is a nice refined gun. I still think the 105 is slightly slicker. It has that more handcrafted feel, but consider with the 105, they brought over a few hundred. With these, they sold several thousand. It was still a pretty small number, and they only had 1 or 2 large import batches, but you could tell. That said, it's a great gun. They have the reinforcing plate. It has all the correct specs because they were made with what we would think of as the TDP, because, Bulgaria was one of the couple of nations that actually got them officially from Russia. So while I really like the Romanian SAR2 and their military's PA-86, which is kind of our other import, if you want an AK74 80s style, either you need to find a 105 or a 104 FR if you want a folder. That said, and I've said it before, say it again, the prices some people are asking and getting for these, multiple thousands are nuts. This gun is not worth $4,000, not worth $3,000, in my opinion. Your mileage may vary. It is a nice gun for what it was originally introduced for. But I sincerely think if you pay that much and get one in your hands, you're going to go, the trigger's the paint finish over the phosphate is definitely military. The bolt throw is nice. It's smooth, but not amazing for that money. This is not a fine-tuned work of art. This feels exactly like what it is. It's a production line, a mass-produced and assembly line gun. It comes out of a good factory in Bulgaria, for sure. But, there's my opinion. Take it for whatever you want. I will say, though, shooting over a couple of days and all these guns, we had no failures out of the ammo, out of the magazines, or out of the guns themselves. And that gets us to the SGL 3194 and the AK74M. When we left off on the history, it was still in prime service, and I did mention the AK-12. Those were tested and getting ready for adoption in 2018. I believe the first actual production batches were 2019. Then there was a revision, sometimes known as the 2023 model, and then those are being delivered through 2025. Russia is getting more and more of the AK-12s in the updated version, but like I said, they produce millions of these. They have a couple of 100,000 AK-12s, and who knows how many were lost to attrition in Ukraine and elsewhere. My point is, still a majority of Russia's armed forces have this or even older AK-74 types. In fact, they've had multiple update programs. I'm not going to dive into them now. I've covered them in past videos, but they've had 2 or 3 different ones, keeping these current, the usual things, adding scope mounts that are more modernized, rail mounts for accessories. One big thing, they seem like they go away from this fixed folding stock to an adjustable length of pull version. Swapping the muzzle brake for something a little more modern comes into vogue. Newer style slings. The magazines, the capacity here is normal. Like I said, some of the AK-12s are spotted with the casket mags, but that doesn't seem to have stuck. They're absolutely not going to AR mags. Why would they? That'd be silly. My point is, this is still a pretty current issue, and it was absolutely a current issue when we got these in. The Saiga series has been coming into America since the 90s. We've covered that relatively recently. The SGL series started off with Arsenal in 2008, and there were a couple of transitional models, the SGL-10, very brief, and the SGL-20, a little more widespread, but it would soon give way to the SGL-21, and they would do a side-folding version in limited numbers, the SGL-2194, but those are in 7.62x39, and we were tickled pink to get those. They came in around late 2008, but unfortunately, what else happened then was the Obama election, and there was a buying panic. So they were kind of hard to get for a minute into 2009. But then we would get the SGL-31 in 5.45 with the fixed stock. Those came in about a year later, late 2009, 2010, in that time frame. And we thought we were riding high. But then in 2011, we got the SGL-3194. And 3184, which was the triangle folding version. And people complained they were too expensive. The thought was, yeah, they're a couple of hundred more than the fixed stalker. Why do you really need a dedicated folder anyway? Of course, people like me and some friends, we wanted them for the historical thing. We went for it, and obviously they've been good. And the first couple of years, 2011, 2012, into 2013, they were sold under the Arsenal brand. Then 2013 into the sanctions. In 2014, they were sold under the FIME Group brand. Same thing. FIME is the parent company of Arsenal. It was more of a legal, technical reason to change the name. The packaging changed a little bit too. These were all made at the Legion Custom Shop at Izhmash, but that doesn't mean that they were like hand-fitted and polished. It means that they were custom to comply with U.S. import regs and Russian export to America regs. So custom in the sense that it was a unique variant destined for America, not that they all had like slicked up bolts and trigger jobs and they were super accurized. That said, these guns, when they came out, the Saigas, the SGLs, were actually cheaper than most of your arsenals. So you got a Russian-built gun, and it was a good price. They were actually a very good value for a while. Then, of course, the sanctions happened and prices started rising and rising precipitously until we get to, kind of where we're at today. I don't foresee that changing. We had some hope with Kalashnikov USA. They delivered a couple of neat things. Then they went away. Now there's talk about them coming back. We will see what happens. I do like their guns. If you just want a clone type thing, I think it's a good idea. This is a very nice gun. But again, it's not worth multiple thousands. And as sold, the SGL 3194s had a few niggling issues, being AK74M clones. The very first SGL 20s and 7.62 had the Bulgarian front sight base. The SGL 21s would introduce the long collar, the appropriate style, and that would be carried over. But they would ship them with their own brake. So I wanted to get a true Russian 74M brake, and I did. This spring-loaded catch back here, they didn't have it. They just had the shelf because they were semi-auto. This was actually a ridiculously hard part to find. Just a little thing. One thing that I never bothered with because I hate popping rivets. I don't mind making superficial changes like this, the muzzle brake, but this is a factory gun. It does bother some people that it doesn't have the reinforcing plate. But to put it in, you have to pop off your trigger guard, pop these old rivets out. To my mind, personal opinion, once you do that, you're kind of removing some of the factoriness. Now, I know it's kind of nitpicking. Really, the reason is it just doesn't bug me enough not having it to worry over it. I notice it's not there. Kind of wish it was. Oh, well. I should also point out, this is a commercial style here because it has the small cutout and the stock latch. In Russia, we've talked about it before, they have restrictions on length and stuff where you can't fold the stock unless your safety's on. It's a whole thing. And that involves this little cutout here. The SGL 1294 is the same way. That does bother some people. They swap the stock. It doesn't bother me because it's still the military spec stock. But it's not a flawless gun, I would say, as far as like being clone correct. The SLR 105 or SLR 104 are both clone correct for what they are. AK-74, AKS-74s from the 80s, but they're not the same as this. The AK-74M uses virtually all different parts. It's not big changes, but once you add them up, if you tried to turn an SLR 104FR into an AK-74M, you would basically have to replace the whole gun. Different front sight base, different gas block styling. This has a different styling here. The receiver shape's a little different. The rail's very different. Smooth top cover, of course. The bolt carrier group with the unfluted piston head, that's different. The bolt itself, you could go into it over and over. But I think my point stands that when you add up all the little differences, it does matter. And if you do want was the current Russian standard gun and is still very much in service today and probably will be for time to come, although it is being phased out, this was your best import option. And at the time they weren't too spendy for what they were. I wish they'd brought over more. It would have been cool if they'd done an AK-105 type. They never did. What do you do? Brought the SLR 105A1 back out because we've already talked about Bulgarian imports, but pretty few and far between. But what wasn't, really about the time the Tandil kits came in, maybe just a little bit after, we started getting Bulgarian AK-74 parts kits in. And we would get them for a very long time. Some with barrels, most without. Some would pretty much look like they were all Arsenal parts, but a lot of them, especially with the furniture, would show up with Russian parts. So there was a big industry for a few years there building 74 types from kits. And one of mine was. I had one of the ORF, Ohio Rapid Fire guns, that still had the original barrel. And that was my first 100% true AK-74 type. They would do well. And then you would have Waffen Works. By this point, they're even offering 5 4.5mm side folders in plum, in wood, and other things. It was just a big industry. Someone else pointed out in my WBP video, but it only took a few bad reports online to kind of wreck Waffenwerks. You can tell I've been talking for a while. And that does kind of relate to WBP too. So I want to compare this, which again is as 74 as you can really get, to the WBP one more time. Because while I don't really worry about parts breaking on this, no more than any other gun at least, there are just a couple of things I wish they would do different, but it's me being me. First, the smooth top cover and in the white bolt grip. Now, the smooth top cover is not a bad feature. The Tantal used it sometimes, the Brill's been seen with it, and it's usually heavier steel, so it's technically a better part. And the bolt carrier in the white, it has a look to it, and it makes for very smooth travel, and it's often very easy to wipe off and clean. So, objectively, that's not a bad thing. But if you're going to do a 74 replica, I wish WBP would nab some rib top covers and at least do some bolts, either phosphated or painted or both, because those two things do kind of jump out at you. It's not just 100% correct. In fact, they really carry over to their 7.62-39 guns, not making them 100% AKM. This does have the paint finish, just like a Polish gun, and I've already praised many times the laminate furniture, so that doesn't bug me. And they are going to the effort of putting the right front sight and gas block on. So as far as a replica, that's about the only major things holding this here back. Now, if you want to get real picky, you could say, well, the firing pin and the bolt are a little different. The rear trunnion isn't exactly 74 spec. Those are internal things. They don't bug me as much. I don't really like the extended shelf on the safety, but that's easy to get rid of. You could either just cut it off or get a different safety. I do like the enlarged paddle, although, again, it's not 100% correct if you're going for a clone, so you might want to do that. And that's a little harder to do because you need to pop this rivet, but it can be done. Talking about the firing pin, I know there are reports of broken firing pins. Look, there are a lot of guns that have broken firing pins. Look how the FNC, there are guns that are prone to it. It can happen to any and every gun. But I will also say, conditions matter. The type of ammo, the type of primer you're using, how you're doing it, those are also factors. And any gun can break a firing pin. It's just good to have a spare if you want. That said, this one's held up fine for me. And, this one's held up for 20 years. It's not as hard as you think to make a firing pin. And that is what I'll say about spare parts too. If there's a series of guns that are prone to breaking a certain part, almost always someone will either import those parts or make them here. Especially like firing pins, that's not very difficult to make if you're a skilled gunsmith or have even a small machine shop. I've literally had machine shops make firing pins for me. The trick is to get the heat treat right, but heck, just make a few and try it out. And again, if one breaks in a little while, I remember Jay had a 9mm AR, I think it was an ATI, might have been something else, that broke like 2 firing pins. So it can happen, it's a thing, it's just like when you drive a car. Something can go wrong anytime, doesn't mean it will. If you don't want your guns to break parts, never shoot them, which means also have no fun at all. If you shoot guns, you run that risk, but I'm not super worried about it, frankly. This doesn't use just uber proprietary parts. We've got a good import pipeline from Poland, be it the FB Radom or the WBPs. Yeah, this really just doesn't worry me. I think it's a nice gun. Do I wish they had done a Tantal? Yeah, probably. But this is a lot more interesting to me than their 5.56 offering, although not as interesting as their 7.62-39 offering, because that's almost an exact AKM complete with the FB rate and barrel. At least you can get them that way. That's the other thing. The nitride barrel doesn't just kill it for me on this, but I don't love it. I'm not gonna present it otherwise, but I do like that they did the front end right, and I do like that it has quality furniture, and I do like that the prices are fair on these compared to kit builds and stuff today. So while it may not completely fit what I'm doing, I would still pick this over a 100% US made, I should say. Not, if you get like an AIM 74 kit build or a Bulgarian or Russian kit build, US receiver, excuse me, US barrel, that's fine. I just don't have much interest in the 100% USA made guns. Tried out one of the PSAs years ago. And, well, the Riley, I'm sure they're fine. I just never have had one offered to me. I never have wanted to buy one just because I've got guns, and no one's ever loaned me one. I'm sure they're fine, but considering the cartridge availability in America right now, I'm not just looking for new guns to get. In fact, I kind of already feel like I've got more than I need, but then I have trouble getting rid of any of them. Back here to end with. The Molots came in. Now, Molot's a much smaller factory than Izhmash, Kalashnikov concern. And their guns were always a little spendier. But also, it's one of the handful of guns the internet didn't internet on. It's one of the very few guns that was sold over here in numbers that I didn't read the internet complaining about it at some point. They are damn good guns. And they were a good option for a couple of years there. Now, the Vepers came in for years, since the late 90s, early 2000s. Robinson Arms, Rob Arms, was the first importer I was aware of, but others did it too. And they were very attractive guns. They were also very sporter, hunting. Some were called the Pioneer guns. They did not look like an RPK. They had the RPK heavy receiver. They did have the heavy barrel, but a lot of them had shorter barrels. Or if they had a long barrel, it was sometimes too long, or in between. They weren't a military style. The furniture wasn't military. Now, one nice thing is most of them did take standard mags, double stack at least, so that was cool. But they were so attractive and well made, it didn't bug a lot of us. A lot of us had a Veper here or there over the years. The first style like this actually came over thanks to IO Real Tiger, as I mentioned. The Russian Molot Veper 1V, not Roman numeral 4 or IV. It really was 1V. This version, introduced in mid-2013, pretty much looked identical to this. I've told the story before, but it was one of the best surprises because Real Tiger advertised them as a thick stock 16-inch barrel. Odd, but also bipod. They also said they had 10-round mags for them. Okay. When I finally got it in, it turns out it had this style of stock. And it had the correct 23-inch barrel. And while the mags did not come directly in the box with the gun, you could buy them from them in the same order. And they were technically 10-round mags they sold for them. They were limited by a coat hanger put inside. They were the standard mags. Now, they were, of course, in 5.56 NATO. Kind of like an RPK 201. We thought we were doing really good to get those. The caliber was a little odd, but, functional. We had the right mags. Everything was good to go. The 1V was a great gun, and it was a sleeper. It's a shame that IO Real Tiger just really didn't seem to be interested in it. It's so funny. That company has got some of the best imports over the years and just never done much with them. Just didn't really seem interested. Luckily for us, about a year and a half later, Fime Group got a hold of the Russian Molot Vepers and introduced the FM series, beginning with the Veper FM 4711 fixed stock, 4721 folder, and 74 and 5.45. Now, it wasn't this style of folder. It was actually the kind of metal tube folder like you saw on the Vepr 12 shotgun. And this series was great. You had a little bit more attention to detail thanks to Fime Group. You had the folding stock, pistol grips, but they still had 16.5-inch barrels. They were the heavy barrels, and some guys were pulling them and finding longer barrels and putting on, custom deals. But they weren't quite, they were still civilianized guns, but they were based on that. But this is right after the sanction of Kalashnikov concern, meaning that Saigas were blocked. So 2015, 2016, guys that had been buying Arsenals and Saigas switched over to the Molot Vepr series. And I'm going to be honest, for the money, it was a great value. Lots of people have done videos talking about the good value. And as I said, it's one of the handful of guns, even though thousands were sold, you just can't find many complaints. But then, June 2017, the Molot factory is added to the list of sanctioned companies because of, events overseas. The Russian government ties itself to different companies, and Molot escaped it because it was considered private. And this isn't really a gun ban, guys. If you look at the list of companies, most weren't even firearms. They were energy companies, gas and all that. Some were different Russian services. Gun companies were the smallest. And Kalashnikov concern being a major supplier, that was obvious. But, Molot, much smaller deal. But then the successor to this gun, or rather would-be successor, the RPK-16 kind of shit that bed. It was planned to be the modernization of this feature and that, doesn't matter. But the issue is Molot worked closely with Kalashnikov concern, the Russian government, got involved, and then it was decided that, the Russian government had direct influence over the Molot factory. Yes, I am super simplifying. I apologize if you want to get into super details. We can do it in another video. It didn't happen, and that meant they got sanctioned. The crappy thing is, too, the RPK-16, after troop tiles and stuff, failed. It was kicked out. They bought a few pre-production batches, but in the 2020s, they said, this isn't what we want, this isn't safe, so the RPK-16 never even happened. Instead, they would actually go with the RPL-20, which just seemed to pass trials last year and is just squeaking into service today in 2025. That means that the RPK74M is still the de facto standard and will remain so for quite a long while as newer guns filter in. Heck, even the original RPK is still kept around, at least some of them are, because, right now Russia needs all the small arms they can get. But what about this gun here? The Fime imported, Molot manufactured Vepr FM RPK 7433. Finally, we were going to get true military spec 5.45 and 7.62-39, so RPK 74M and RPKM Veprs. After all these years, the Vepr 1B was the closest we had. Now, again, I know some guys did custom builds. That always was expensive because the barrels were always hard to find. That was just in the works when the sanctions happened. Therefore, very few of these ended up getting imported and sold, along with the parts to kind of put them to rights. And the ones that came over, especially early on, K-Bar was auctioning off, and they were going for crazy money. Now, I have to mention this just because even years later, I'm very grateful. I approached Cliff at K-Bar that I kind of just knew through the forums and said, look, you and I both know this is a gun that I would love for the collection for me. I don't want to mess around with an auction. They're going crazy. What can you do, me as a dealer? What can you do me one? And he's like, okay, look. Is this for you, or are you going to resell it? Because we don't, if we sell you one and it shows up on Gunbroker the next day, that's not going to look good. He put his neck out on the line for me because I said, no, this is for me. He trusted me, and it wasn't free. It was far from free, but it was right on that line of, what I could do. It was a fair enough price considering what the auctions were going for, and the fact that I had a Vepr 1V that I could, sell to cover it. So that thankfully helped. So, even years later, I have to give credit there for him trusting me, listening to me, because he could very easily, at any step along the way, not done that. And I could have just been left to try to do an auction, whatever. Now, later, you did see some on their website, but good golly, the sticker price. I even got some of the 7.62-39 guns and got some RPK wood furniture and put it on, and that was a sharp looking gun. I'm not gonna lie. If these weren't so crazy, I would have kept both styles, but what do you do? It is one of my absolute favorites. It really is. As you see, it's a lot of fun to shoot. It's authentic. And as I mentioned with the Saiga, the SGL-31, there were a couple of things I needed to change to at least get it pretty close to military. Well, with this gun, I didn't. I put this Molot grip on. I could have easily used just a standard. The other thing I really did, these came with a muzzle nut. I put on a birdcage flash hider. The one on mine is Russian, but Bulgarian ones were and maybe still are available at Arsenal K-Var. They look the same. I mean, the only difference is the Bulgarians are a little bit thicker internally. Externally, they're the same. If you put a Bulgarian on these, no one would know unless you told them. But I just happened to know someone at the time who had Russian stuff, so cool. But I did put the right device on, and I put this, 2-clip kind of Afghan war era sling. Other than that, I can't remember anything else I changed. This gun was one of the most good-to-go guns, and I have to give Arsenal credit for that, for the most part. When they do replica types, they don't do it half-assed most of the time. You might pay for their services, but they usually do deliver what people want. And again, I think if the sanctions hadn't come through on Molot in 2017, this would have been the big announcement for the fall season of that year, or maybe SHOT Show 2018, because that's kind of when these started to hit the market, around 2018. But always in limited numbers because there's always post-sanction. At least we got the SGL-31s for a couple of years before, well, at least the folders for a couple of years. We got the, the fixed stocks for several years, probably longer than we should have. In some ways, there are more SGLs than SLR 104s, 105s out there. No, it's a cool gun, and I do like that it's an import. Nothing wrong with kit builds, but even RPK 74 kit builds are rare because this is still common standard issue in Russia. The only kits that came in were a few hundred out of Bulgaria several years ago. Vector had a lot of those, built them up. But yeah, even the other 5.45, the earlier ones, very uncommon in America. So that's something too. And it's a shame too, because it is a really fun cartridge. And I mentioned it in the first video, but the fate of the cartridge in America today. Let's end there. So those are two subjects: the cartridge in America today, and kind of how I rank these guns and that I personally own. I'm not worried about the cartridge just disappearing and being unobtainium. Yes, most of it we were getting was Russian. I don't think we're going to see Russian ammo imports any day soon, and if we do, it will not be inexpensive. Frankly, I think our best hope is the Romanian supply connection, because they use the gun, they make the ammo for their military, and they're switching over to a more common NATO cartridge. So they're going to have the projectiles, yada, yada, yada. Now keep in mind, just because 7 and 6 out of Russia was banned, since technically the Romanian loading is different, it's not 7 and 6, it's not expressly prohibited from importation. But of course, they could also just, make stuff 60 grain for the American market, and that solves that too. And with the Red Army standard, I think that's our best hope for an import. It's also possible Poland could tool up. We'll see. I don't think we're going to see anything out of North Korea, although I was shocked we got the Asian contract kits, but that was kind of by a whole different way. That wasn't out of North Korea directly. That's really it, though. I mean, the East German stuff, they only adopted the AK74 around 85, 86. They didn't make that many. And today, the MPI M74 kits are super expensive with or without barrel. No semi-automatic imports. Sad, but that's why I don't have an East German. But I love to have a build, absolutely. Am I willing to pay multiple thousands for one? No, I am not, because it looks pretty much like this gun, but with East German furniture. And I like variation in life. Again, if it was inexpensive, relatively speaking, I probably would. But outside of that, we pretty much have gotten 5.45 kits or guns out of the nations that did do. People have also mentioned like the Ukraine war. I don't think we're going to see surplus out of Ukraine, one way or the other. It just doesn't seem likely, not in large numbers. There's political reasons, there's financial business reasons, and there's just kind of military reasons for that. So, the cartridge in America, I think Romania is our best import. There have been domestic efforts. I don't know what's going on with the PSA. I never really followed too closely. The prices weren't all that attractive. Then there were various reports online. Again, I know everyone can make a lemon. The internet kind of magnifies the bad and kind of de-emphasizes the good. So I'm not going to condemn the PSA line because I don't have firsthand experience. Because again, the cost wasn't there for me. I think I have shot a box or two of it that someone gave me, but other than that, the Hornady stuff, it was American made, but it used some imported stuff. No, I think the ammo will stick around. The question is cost. As I said kind of at the top of the video, it being 10 cents a round was just luck of the time because they had a lot of surplus available. They were getting rid of their old 7 and 6 stocks to replace it with the more modern loadings. Even if the ammo had not been sanctioned, banned, whatever, the price was already going up. It was not 10 cents a round in 2012, 2013, 2014. The 10 cents a round thing was 2009. Yeah, and then it got out. So I don't think that was just one of those things. That's how surplus works. Same with the kits. They're cheap when they come in and they go up. The imported ammo until 2020s kind of stayed the same. I bought my first ammo from SAR2 from Wolf, and it stayed pretty stable for 20 years. But it won't ever come back again. Be it import or domestic, I think we will be able to get the ammo, but it's going to be boutique pricing. I would like to see 40 cents a round, and I think if Romania does it, we might see that, 40, 45. But if it has to be partially built here or kind of small batch stuff, you're going to see 50, 60 cents a round or more. That's just how special the ammo is. 5.45x39 was always going to be specialty ammo in America. Those handful of cheerleaders online that thought somehow it was going to make a big splash here, and it never was. In fact, it did a little better here than I anticipated, but it was always going to be a flash in the pan because it was on the global market. Even the nations like Poland and Romania that also adopted it Poland got rid of it quickly. Romania is desperately trying to, and it looks like they probably finally have. Russia was only the big user left afterwards. Some of it's satellite stage, sure. Ukraine used it because they had them, but it wasn't like it was bad. It just was close enough to 5.56 because it was basically, if not a straight clone, heavily inspired by it. So only one, it's like Highlander, only one was going to be king, and with the U.S. support. That said, while I don't know that I would run out and buy a 5.45 gun today because of the ammo situation, I'm not and never have been tempted to sell mine. I like them too much for their history. I do have ammo swirled away. And once that's finally gone, there are enough of these in the country between the other imports and kit builds and a few other things. Some company will supply ammo. That said, it will probably be specialty ammo prices, not cheap, but it will be there to, shoot it once on the 4th of July, which is kind of what I'm doing with my guns already, is, just getting them out, once every year or so. I think the last time I had these out was last September. Here we are, October. Enjoy them, you know, remind myself what I really like about them, put them up for another day. What's funny is the 5.45 guns are doing very well in the collector market. So, I guess I can count. I rarely buy guns as a quote-unquote investment, but if they end up being an investment, I'm not going to complain, and you wouldn't either. This gun's a good example. I picked it up quite affordably, and if you made me sell all but maybe 5 AKs, probably this one and the SGL. But then, you know, that Vepr too. Yeah, it's funny. Even though 5.45 is a minor part of my collection, some of my favorite guns are in 5.45. And it's a big part of Soviet history. Because I remember before you could get the guns over here, it was this weird, mysterious cartridge that we all kind of, not lusted after. It was just that weirdness, you know, that factor. That hipster is before hipsters were a thing. Oh well. Since this video is kind of my personal take and opinions on semi-autos in America, I've got to share a pet peeve with you. Making a AK74, there are Bulgarian kits available, parts, even today. That's not a big deal. You can easily do that. You can even kind of halfway fudge it like this, you know, a couple of things not right, but overall it looks like a 74. Pretty well parts compatible, all that. What makes me roll my eyes is when another US maker says they're doing an AK100, AK Century series, be it AK74M, AK101, 103, etc. Because most times, looking at UPSA, they take an AK74, AKS74, and they slap polymer furniture on it and give it a coat of black paint, and that's it. Look, it's fine, but it's not. It's like, if you're just saying this is what it is, but if you're marketing it as an AK103 clone, do it right. It just, again, it's a personal pet peeve. Now, they get a little bit of bonus points if they at least put a smooth top cover on, because that's pretty easy to do. But one thing I've tried to convey throughout all these videos, every part on this is different from an AKS74. Not just the 5.5mm pin, it's the angle of the receiver and trunnion. They're different back here. The trigger guard has a different footprint. The bolt, especially the piston, the bolt group and the piston, they look different. Your barrel hardware is different, especially the long collar up here. It's a big difference and a big improvement, in my opinion. Again, I know I'm being pedantic, so I'm not leveling any exact criticism, but I'm just sharing something that personally bugs me. That's why the Saiga is about as good as we're probably ever going to get for an AK-74M. It's also why I did like Kalashnikov USA, and I'm very interested to see if they return and how they do, because they did it how I would have done it. They got the little details right, and when they didn't, they knew it, but it was like, okay, this is just a technical thing. Like, as I pointed out with the 104, 105, they didn't give it the right rear sight, but they knew that. It just wasn't worth their time to retool and make a whole different rear sight. You know, just be honest. Like, hey, we can't do a cold hammer forged chrome line barrel. We're going to do, a button rifle chrome line barrel. This is why. Fine, I can accept that. Just no. When people know what they're doing and fess up, but when they try to pass off what is an AK-74 is an AK-74M and don't even acknowledge where they cut corners, that bugs me. Again, we all have our little picadillos, and I know you guys have yours too, and there's times we disagree. That's just mine. And, there's all that talk about the Meridian 101s and 103s. We'll see, but I'm real picky, because otherwise just do an AK-74 and AKS-74. I hate when things are half measures. Just kind of how I am. Oh well, Just thought I'd share that, get it off my chest a little bit. Ranking the guns I own would be very hard to do. I've especially picked them over the years. I don't have very many 5.45 guns, but the ones I have I really enjoy. And they each kind of fill a niche. This is Russian, and it's a 74M. The SAR-2, now that I've reworked it, is a PA-86, and it's a good gun, and I have a lot of emotional attachment to it. The Vepr, it does a lot for me too, because I love RPKs, and that's as good as it's ever going to get. The SLR-105, that's an AK74. Like, it's the bog standard, especially with that Russian wood on it. The SLR-104FR, it's a side folder, and it's got plum. You got to have some plum in the mix, right? I don't know how I would pick my absolute favorite. They each have their own things. The 104, the 105, the SGL, the Vepr, they're all at the top, along with the SAR-2. More for the personal connection there. So those 5. So I'm going to oil these down, clean them up, and stick them in the safe for another year or so, till it feels like it's time to shoot some 5.45 again. It is fun. I will not lie about that. Especially in the wintertime when the heating up isn't such a big deal. Now, I will say that when I'm recording this, the only reason I'm doing this today is I did move this gun. I did go ahead and sell it. I was going through my stuff. It's a fun shooter. It was kind of my shooter 5.45, but with ammo less available. Yeah, so it's already sold. It's about to get boxed up and go to its new home. It was an easy sell, not because it's bad, but just because, well, the reasons I've already outlined, frankly. It just doesn't really do anything in my collection necessary. Next to that, maybe the RPK 74, partially because it's a kit build, partially because it looks so similar to the Vepr that could go. I'm not there yet on it, because I do love RPKs. Those are very hard things for me to sell. But once you go past that, if you made me choose between the Arsenals, the 105 and the 104FR, with great protest, I would have to sell the 104FR. A couple of reasons. One, I just like the look of the 105, the bog standard more. 2, I do have a folder in this, seeing if it doesn't have the same, metal stock. And 3, as nice as the 104 is as a shooter, the bolt throw, the trigger pull, it's fine. The 105 is nicer. You can tell it was an earlier Arsenal when they took their time. It's just all around just a little bit nicer of a gun. Plus, as much as, I like polymer furniture, you make me pick, I'm always going to pick wood. So, there you go. I can say that's kind of there. That leaves the SGL, the 105, and the SAR-2. If you made me pick between those, along with the Vepr, those 4, I don't think I could, guys. I just don't. I feel like if I got rid of any of them, I would be just cutting the jugular of my collection. And I'm kind of one of those people that if you make me get down to just that point, I'll just sell all the goddamn things. At that point, looking at the remaining ones just would upset me. At that point, I'd just get out of 5.45, as hard as that would be, especially with this gun and the SAR-2. Because those two probably have the most emotional connection to me. But hopefully, I won't have to face that decision, because we're allowed to own multiple guns. So people always ask, what's your favorite, or what would you keep? I kind of don't like those questions, because why do I have to fight? That's like saying, okay, which of your children would you keep and let the other? Come on, that's a silly question. We're allowed to have multiples of things. But I can at least share the ones that I could trim out and not get too upset. But once I get to those last 4 or 5, I don't think I could do it. And the same thing goes for my 7.62 39 AKs as well. And I've already sold a few guns, back during COVID and whatnot, like my RPKS. Cool gun, but, didn't need all that many. But yeah, people asked, so I thought I would address it here. This is Misha, and I'm really surprised Miss Peanut has not joined us. It's a little late, so she might have already zonked out. With that, I think I'll do the same. Catch you very soon next time.